Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Adithya Gopinath, Postdoctoral Associate at University of Florida. Adithya is also a 2020 Toffler Scholar. Today's discussion is focused on the relationship between the central nervous system, immune system, and Parkinson's disease. So let's dive in. Welcome, Adithya.
Thanks, Deb.
It is so wonderful to have you on this podcast. We've known each other now for a couple of years. We talk fairly frequently because your research is progressing and is exciting, and we'll get to hear about it today. But, I would just like to start with, how did you get into research? I think if you wouldn't mind sharing your story, it's a pretty amazing story about what led you to research as a profession.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started my undergrad years ago now, initially everybody comes into school with the starry-eyed vision that everybody wants to be a doctor. I think literally 90% of undergrads want to be a doctor. So that, of course, that was me too. So, I kept on that track, but unfortunately, towards the end of my undergrad career, just in the last few months, I actually ended up getting really sick. And it was a mystery. Nobody could really figure out what was going on. And I ended up having to take a 2-year leave of absence from school in order to figure it out and get a diagnosis and get treatment. But of course, getting that diagnosis was going to be the first step. And honestly, it was just a mystery. It was very hard for the professionals to figure it out. So I had done a little bit of research up until that point. I'd taken a lot of science classes and I knew how to keep a notebook. So I ended up keeping really, really detailed notes about all sorts of nitpicky little details that were happening from day to day. And within about 7 months, I managed to figure out that I had some kind of a GI problem, a stomach problem. And I went to see the appropriate doctors. I had made a whole list of symptoms and I said, we can rule out these things, we can rule out this. These are the tests we need to do. We need to do this. And within 2 days, I had a diagnosis and I was able to get treatment for an autoimmune disease. And in a year, a little bit over a year from there, I was back on my feet and I was ready to go back to school. And after that experience, I really realized that detailed interrogation of pulling apart what's happening behind the scenes, that was really where my passion lay. And I went right into a research career track after that. And I went ahead, applied to graduate school, got my PhD, and here I am doing more research.
Yeah, that's amazing. So it's not a criticism, but why was the diagnosis by others so hard? And what was it that you were able to do that were able to do this on your own?
So when it comes to diagnosing an autoimmune disease, these are notoriously hard diseases to diagnose. And a lot of folks who have seen a lot of these medical shows, after a long, convoluted, episode, they'll finally arrive at some kind of an autoimmune disease or the other. And that's really not far from the truth. Unfortunately, most real life patients don't have a doctor sitting by their bedside all the time taking notes. And that really was what was required. And so if there had been somebody with me watching me and taking notes on everything that I was doing for 7 months, they would have probably figured it out too. Of course, that's impossible. So that really left it up to me to pull this apart, dissect it, and try and understand what was going on.
Yeah, I think, it's kind of a testament to who you are and your curiosity. And we should all be very grateful that you're in research and you're studying these diseases that, really affect people in a very, very negative way. So you'll be the one that makes some breakthroughs.
I do love solving puzzles, and that's really what research and basic science is all about. It's about taking a very complicated picture, break it down into its fundamental parts, and then figuring out what it means.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So you're a postdoc, and not to spend too much time on it, but I think some of our listeners may not understand the evolution of a researcher and all the education and all the steps that you have to go through. So, what is a postdoc? What happened before, and what's going to happen after?
That's a great question. So typically when somebody is going for any kind of a doctoral degree, particularly a PhD, after undergraduate or a master's, people apply to graduate school. They go 5 to 7 years studying for and completing and defending their PhD. And then after that, of course, a lot of PhDs, choose different career tracks. I'm trying to go into an academic track. But before you can have any kind of a title that includes professor, you typically have a span of time in which you're a postdoc, which means you have your doctorate, but you're not yet a professor. So my title technically is Dr. Adithya Gopinath, but I'm not professor anything yet. So my title is postdoc, which means I have my doctorate, but I'm not yet a professor.
And to become a professor, then on these steps, you are working towards someday having your own lab, guiding a unique pathway of research. And so that's what you're kind of working on now. And
Absolutely.
your mentors and are such are helping you kind of find that way.
Absolutely. So the point of having a postdoc, doing a postdoctoral fellowship, is really to kind of establish your own research direction that's independent from the people who are teaching you. Because, of course, somebody else is already doing that research. The point of doing science is to find new things. So what I'm working on right now is to really pull apart what was happening, the mechanisms behind the observations that I was able to make all through my PhD work. And I'm aiming for that to be the continuation of my entire career.
So your PhD, what was the focus?
So when I first started my PhD, we had just recognized that there was this protein called the dopamine transporter. And we've been studying it for decades on neurons in the brain. And we know that the cells that express dopamine transporter in the brain are the ones that get affected when somebody has Parkinson's disease. But it turned out that the same protein is actually also on immune cells in our blood. So that was a real head scratcher. And so we started to figure out, number one, what does this protein do on immune cells? And number two, since we know this is changing in the brains of people with Parkinson's, does this protein also change on the immune cells? And I'm really happy to report that that was a resounding yes. So essentially, we have exactly what's happening. We have the opposite of what's happening in the brain happening in the immune system. So in the brain, this marker decreases when somebody has Parkinson's. In the immune system, it actually increases. And it seems to actually be sensitive to whether or not treatments are working properly for Parkinson's. So when somebody positively responds to treatment, these levels change again. So there's this very interesting connection between what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the immune system. And that really will end up becoming the focus of my research going forward.
So in a previous discussion that you and I had kind of offline, there is a dementia, Lewy body dementia, that kind of can be misdiagnosed as Parkinson. Can you kind of talk about the difference of those and, just maybe explain, because there may be people out there that have loved ones or themselves that have never heard of Lewy body dementia?
That's an excellent question. Now, I should say from the start that I'm not necessarily an expert on Lewy body disease, Lewy body dementia, but I could definitely tell you about where these symptoms overlap with Parkinson's and why sometimes it's so hard to tell these apart. So when Lewy body dementia, Lewy body disease, as it's more broadly called, when it starts, one of the first things that seems to happen is people have movement problems. They have problems with their walking. They have problems with their hand movements. As an example, actually, my uncle actually has Lewy body disease, or at least we think he does. It's unfortunately one of those diseases that can't be definitively diagnosed until postmortem, but all the symptoms are consistent. And one of the first things he noticed was that every now and then he couldn't sign his signature properly. And this is actually something that also happens in Parkinson's. It can be one of the earliest symptoms of Parkinson's. And so at the very beginning, his doctors actually thought he had Lewy body. He actually had Parkinson's, and they were trying to treat him for Parkinson's. until very quickly it became clear that there were other symptoms that were also occurring that just were not consistent with what happens in Parkinson's. So, as an example, he had very lucid hallucinations. So, he knew that what he was seeing wasn't actually there, but he would still say, I'm seeing, this is what I'm seeing. I know it's not happening, but I'm seeing it. Or, he would see, he would hear things that definitely weren't happening. He knew they weren't happening. He knew there was nothing there, but he said he heard it. And then periodically he would have lapses in his memory. And as the disease progressed, now Lewy body disease can also progress at a very different rate than Parkinson's. So unfortunately, in the 8-9 years since he's been diagnosed, he's declined very rapidly. So something I've unfortunately had to see firsthand.
Yeah. Yeah. So you say that you're not an expert in Lewy body disease, but what could be, and these are the kind of the common things. How is that and maybe maybe you can't answer this question, but if someone goes to the doctor and, gets some kind of diagnosis, how can they maybe better communicate what's going on with them, kind of pay attention? Because we started this conversation with you really paying attention to yourself. What would be some of the things that would be helpful as they would go into, to the doctor?
So at the very beginning, when they first go to the doctor, it probably would be very difficult for the patient to be able to recognize the difference between Lewy body disease and Parkinson's disease. In fact, they may not even recognize that what they have as being either one of them. But one of the things as time goes on within the first few years, it would be really helpful if the patient was able to communicate with the doctor, number one, if they felt that the treatments that they were being given were helping. So if somebody's being treated for Parkinson's disease, and one of the first line treatments is L-Dopa, it's a common name for this is Sinemet. And that drug tends to work very, very well in the early stages of Parkinson's. People have a great response to it. It relieves a lot of their symptoms, and they're more or less able to go about their day-to-day lives. But for somebody with Lewy body disease, that's often not the case. And so instead of a patient just kind of sitting back and saying, oh, well, maybe the drug is working, maybe it's not working, just communicating that with their doctor would open their doctor's eyes and say, oh, maybe there's something more going on here, and they can do some more digging.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So going back to your research, this connection between the brain and the immune system, I mean, is this a fairly recent kind of perspective that is being looked at? Because that seems like almost far-fetched.
So you're absolutely right. It does seem far-fetched for good reason. So my very first neuroscience textbook that I had in 2006, so this wasn't that long ago in terms of science and human history. I remember this line in that textbook that said, the brain is an immune privileged organ and it has its own unique immune system. And the immune system outside of the brain is totally separate and has nothing to do with the brain. This was a textbook line that we were all taught in school. And since that time, it's become really obvious that's just not the case. Immune cells go into the brain, they leave the brain, they can do good things and bad things when they go into the brain. And it turns out that there are parts of the brain that are connected with parts of the immune system via a whole bunch of different ways. And so if something changes in the brain, we now recognize there's a good chance that something else is going to change the immune system. And whether that's good or whether that's bad really is going to depend on the disease and what's going on with the patient.
So the connection there is through blood, or how does it, kind of go back and forth?
Great question also. So we think there's probably at least 3 different ways this can happen. So when there's any kind of a brain disease, so there's a part of the brain called the blood-brain barrier. And this is what we used to attribute as, this brain is this completely sealed off compartment. But the blood-brain barrier actually is permeable under very specific circumstances. And whenever there's a brain disease, the blood-brain barrier can start to release things and it can let things back into the brain. So stuff can leave the brain, go into the blood, and stuff can go from the blood back into the brain. So that's one way. Another way is there are actually, so all of us have lymph nodes. And anytime somebody has tonsillitis, for instance, you feel the big lymph nodes in your throat. And so those lymph nodes actually receive drainage from your brain. And so there's actually lymph fluid that enters those lymph nodes, and then your immune system learns about what's going on in the brain. And then number 3, we and others have recently been digging into this idea that there may actually be nerve connections between parts of the brain and going directly into the immune system. And that's a much newer area of study, and it's quite cutting edge, actually. And so that's one of the areas we're looking at. And it seems that if you change something in a part of the brain, there are actually nerve pathways that signal straight to the periphery into your immune organs, and it can change the way those immune organs function, thereby changing your immune system.
And the immune organs are what?
So that can be the spleen, that can be the lymph nodes, it can even be your bone marrow. Bone marrow is actually where all of our immune cells ultimately come from. So they're immune stem cells that live in your bone marrow, and they end up making all the cells that circulate in our blood. So all of these different regions could potentially be impacted by changes in the brain via direct connections.
Wow. So complicated. You've said, oh, I'm not an expert in this. It seems like, with this expansion of knowledge and kind of maybe more even a whole body kind of approach to understanding these diseases of what we thought were the brain, you're having to expand your research, your capability, your skills. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think scientists everywhere would agree with is the more you learn about science, the more you recognize, the less you know.
Yeah.
So we start to learn, and our science horizons get bigger, and our recognition of our awareness is we recognize we know so little about what's going on, and there's so much left to discover.
So what other challenges do you have? Trying to kind of pursue this research. You've had some big breakthroughs. I know you've published on some things. What challenges do you have with, not just having to expand your capability and your knowledge, but what other challenges do you find that you have to overcome, kind of in your day-to-day pursuit?
Great question. So there are large, as I mentioned, until 15 or 20 years ago, the brain was considered completely separate from the immune system. And as you can probably imagine, there are a lot of scientists that have been doing science for a lot longer than 15 or 20 years. So these are people who were taught the old way of thinking, and they still very much cling to that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Science is slow for a reason, because it helps us prevent errors. But we've pretty definitively shown that changes in the brain affect the immune system and vice versa. But there is, at times, a lot of times, really an uphill battle trying to show the very well-established people in our scientific fields that the things we're doing are real and are in fact worth studying. And there are those that embrace new very quickly, and there are those that are super resistant to change. And that's okay. We need that diversity because it helps us slow down and not make mistakes. But at the same time, it can be a little frustrating sometimes when we're constantly fighting an uphill battle.
Yeah. Alvin Toffler and Alvin and Heidi, they coined this phrase that they said obsolete, right? Obsolete knowledge, where just the speed of knowledge creation, new knowledge creation, would overcome some of the beliefs or old knowledge that is no longer accurate. I'm assuming that this is the case.
I love that word, obsolete. Yes, that's definitely one of my favorite concepts. It is absolutely the case. New knowledge does overcome older knowledge, but there's always resistance to change. That's just human nature.
Yeah. But you said, sometimes this is good because of the balance. If everything was new, we wouldn't be having those debates or those constructive conflict trying to test out these hypotheses. So I guess, that is, I guess that is a positive thing. So, you talked about this need to kind of explore what you don't know. And I've talked on other of these podcasts around the importance of collaboration and network. And can you, how important is that to you? Can you talk about your network and kind of that ecosystem that you work in?
It's absolutely essential. So, in decades past, maybe a century ago, science was something that one lone person in a basement with a microscope could do. They would take lots of notes. They would look through the microscope, take some more notes, make some drawings, and that was science. But science just is not done by single people in isolation anymore. Science is a hugely collaborative team effort. And as our technology has advanced, I mean, just consider the advent of the telephone and conference calls, for instance. When that advanced, when that arrived, people could call each other all over the country and all of a sudden have quick conversations about things that they're discovering. And that's just gone exponentially faster now. We're having a video call right now, and we're recording live. This is extraordinary technology, and it's really made both the ability to collaborate, to network, and to work together. And it's also made it absolutely essential that we do this, because science has also become so complicated that it's really impossible for one person to have enough expertise in enough different areas to be able to follow through a whole question and figure out what's going on. Just as an example, I could tell you all day about the way dopamine neurons work. And so these are the neurons that are affected in Parkinson's disease. I could tell you all about how the immune system develops. And this is also central to my work. But if you start to ask me about, I don't know. Let's actually go back to some of the alternate hypotheses in Parkinson's. So there are many different hypotheses in Parkinson's, one of these being synucleopathy. And this might be a term that people have heard recently because there have been a lot of new drugs that have been targeting this protein called alpha-synuclein. I can tell you briefly about how alpha-synuclein works, but if you ask me to get into the nitty-gritty details, I'm completely clueless. But I can absolutely point you to somebody 3 buildings away who has been living and breathing and working with alpha-synuclein for 25, 30 years. And that person would be able to answer any question I had about alpha-synuclein. That's really the benefit of having a network of researchers who have similar goals but completely different expertise.
So I would imagine too, the network of funders is important. And, the trust, the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust, has given you some grants. We fund probably different kind of research, maybe very early research that is riskier. Other funders will, fund other parts of your research. Can you talk about funding and the challenges as a researcher, especially trying to start your own lab and really take that off? What is that challenge?
That is an amazingly important question. And you've hit the nail right on the head. So when somebody's doing early stage risky research, big institutions like the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, are very, very risk averse. And just as an example, I'm currently putting together my early independence grant. And so I have to project my next 2 years and then the next 3 years after that, the kinds of research I'm going to be doing, what kind of methods I'm going to be using, the techniques I'm going to be using. And essentially, I need to have been able to show that everything I'm proposing I can do, and I need to have done some percentage of every single thing I'm proposing. But when you're an early stage researcher and the NIH isn't supporting you, how do you come up with the time and the money to generate all of this data to show that what you're doing actually matters, is feasible, and you can actually do it? It would kind of be impossible, really. So it becomes a catch-22. And that's where organizations like the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust come in, because without the support of the trust, I would not have been able to generate the last 3 years of data that are going into the application that I'm submitting to the NIH that's hopefully going to help me open an independent lab. And that's not to say once I have an independent lab, the floodgates are open. That's not the case at all. Every step of the way, whenever you're trying to apply for funding, there's a huge burden of proof on the researcher who's submitting that application. And we're constantly trying to bridge between funding sources. And without support from partners like the trust, I don't think many of us would get by.
Yeah, and there's other philanthropist organizations, family offices, other trusts that are out there that know that this kind of research, or know that these diseases are very impactful for people and their families, that they would like to help fund. And a part of this is just finding people like you and trying to give that channel to help you.
And conversely, it's also for us to find people like you and to find people like the trustees of the Karen Toffler Trust, because we tend to have very, very siloed networks. So we're very good at talking to other scientists. We're really good at networking with people at conferences who do the kind of science we do. But I don't want to speak too broadly, but we tend to be a little bit illiterate, so to speak, when it comes to the broader financial network and where to even go looking for people who might be willing to support our research. And recently, actually, the trust has been able to connect me with partners who have been helping us find those funding sources. And so that's another example of networking, not scientific networking per se, but networking in the broader sense.
Yeah. No, it's so important. I mean, it's all of us only have 24 hours a day, and we're experts in our own area, and we can't be experts everywhere. So the networking and the collaboration, very important. There's researchers that are aspiring to be a researcher, aspiring to go into academia. What kind of words of advice do you have for them, either listening or the ones that you're coaching and mentoring that are working with you? What some key things that they should be considering?
So I'm mentoring students here in our lab. I'm mentoring students outside the lab. I'm mentoring other postdocs. And one of the things I have to remind people is that when people see scientific publications, when they see scientific presentations, what they're seeing is the fraction of research that has actually produced positive, exciting results. They have to keep in mind there's a whole 90% of the iceberg under the water that they don't see. And those are all the things that didn't work. So when somebody publishes a very exciting, impactful publication, that doesn't mean everything that they've been doing for the past 10 years has always worked. We have so many disappointments and so many failures. And I think that's the case in a lot of different fields. But in science, for some reason, this is just not talked about very often. And I feel like I've seen a lot of students firsthand who just get so dejected. They say, oh, well, my experiments never work, or so many experiments fail. I said, yep, join the club. So it's really important to learn that each failure is a step towards succeeding.
Yeah, I think that that's kind of good for the general public, because science and technology has become such almost a routine. Announcements every day, a new breakthrough, a new technology. It moves very fast, that we kind of assume that it's all success, but it's really not. And you've talked about that journey of how long it takes to create science and good information.
Absolutely. Science is by design and by definition slow. And it takes whole armies working together for 10 years, 15 years to produce that one breakthrough. And although it sounds like there's a new breakthrough coming up every day, these are different teams, different armies in different places that have been working across continents to produce those breakthroughs. And they're all coming from different places. That's number one. And number two, the other thing that's important to keep in mind, and I like to emphasize this because there has been maybe not a lot of, but there's been a fair amount of questioning of scientific accuracy, especially what's been happening during the COVID-19 pandemic that we've seen over the last 4 years. And science tends to be self-correcting. And what I mean by that is there's a reason that there are a great many people working on the same subject in a whole bunch of different places, because everybody produces results and the results look correct, but then our job as scientists is to test one another's results. And so we test and retest our results, we test other people's results, and that's how science corrects itself, because we figure out where the problems are, we learn together, and then we move forward.
So you're back to your research. Your research is really trying to the understanding, the mechanisms, the biomarkers, if you would. Is that correct?
That's accurate, yes.
And then, so is there, kind of looking into the future, is there diagnostics that come out of this where we can test? Talk a little bit about what you see, hopefully, maybe aspirational for the next 5 or 7 years that might happen.
Oh, that's a great time frame, actually, because in order for a test to become officially approved by the FDA and to be applied to patients, it has to go through the hands of different people at different institutions and has to be reproduced consistently for at least 5 years before the FDA would even consider it to be an official test. And I'm really glad that you brought up aspirational goals, because one of my dreams is really that maybe we've developed a blood-based biomarker, a blood test that people can start adding to their blood work after they turn 50, for instance. And the reason I say 50 is because the main risk factor for Parkinson's is really age. So as people get older, their chances of getting Parkinson's goes up. But oftentimes we don't catch it until it's much further down the road. So my dream is maybe everybody, all of us, one day will have this incorporated into our standard labs by our primary care physician. And if the physician sees some numbers that are a little bit off, they'll say, hey, maybe you should go talk with this neurologist that I know in town. And that might set the ball rolling for people to hopefully get future therapeutics. These don't exist yet, but future therapeutics that might slow or even stop the progression of the disease. That's really the dream of every Parkinson's researcher, is to slow down or stop the disease.
Do you think that this understanding of the linkage between what's going on in the brain through the wider nervous system, the immune system, do you think at some point we may challenge that notion that it is a age-related disease? Or is there, I don't know, there's other researchers that are researching other parts of the brain, other aspects of it that I've talked to that have said it doesn't have to be this way. Just, because we're getting older, we might be with an increased understanding of what's really going on. We may be even able to test even earlier and possibly stop, possibly reboot, if you would, with CRISPR or stem cell, whatever it may be. But is that too far-fetched on this? Or,
No.
I don't want to put you on the spot and say anything, but does it have to be an age-related disease?
Honestly, all the evidence is no, actually. And the reason I say that is because we have really accumulated evidence over the last 30, 40 years that what we recognize as Parkinson's when somebody's in their 50s or 60s has actually started 20 or more years before that. And we usually only, hindsight 2020, we can see it in hindsight, but we didn't recognize it at the time. And so my hope, and the evidence suggests this may end up being the case in the future, is that we might be able to detect that somebody may develop full-blown Parkinson's 10 years before it happens. And if that's the case, if we can develop therapeutics that can help slow down or stop the disease progression, that would be the time to do it. So that's one of the goals that a lot of people working on this have, is to have early detection, early biomarkers for Parkinson's. Because by the time a person develops Parkinson's, by the time they develop a tremor, for instance, a large percentage of the neurons in the brain that are affected in Parkinson's have already died. And the brain has this amazing ability to compensate for changes, but that's kind of tipped over that threshold where it can compensate. If we can stop the disease progression before it tips over that threshold, a lot of people are very optimistic that maybe people won't ever develop full-blown Parkinson's. And now, of course, I say that that's a dream, that's optimistic, that's looking into the future, but I don't think it's far-fetched to say it's possible. We just have to get there, and we'll get there together.
So I seem to recall in another offline conversation that you and I had is these neurons that are in the brain. There's only some 5,000 of them in the brain that control our motor skills. Is that?
There's a very small number of them. Let's put it that way. So there are trillions of cells in the brain. We can count them in the thousands, the number of these dopamine neurons that help control our movement. And these cells are very active. They're very critical to the way we function from day to day. Everything from whether or not we can eat to whether we can walk to whether we blink our eyes seems to be mediated by these neurons. So these cells are working constantly. They have a huge burden. And when some of them start to go, bad things start happening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just absolutely wild to think that, percentage wise, it's just a few percentage or even less that is responsible for such a major part of what it means to live life.
I agree.
Yeah. So what technologies do you currently use in your research any thoughts about machine learning and, AI and some of the things that others are looking towards to be helpers in research?
Now, it's funny that you mentioned that within the context of what we discussed earlier, and I'll get to that in just a second. So, as far as the technologies that we use currently, we're using a lot of technologies that produce data very quickly, but it takes us a long time to mine through it and understand what it means. As an example, in the last 6 months, I have produced data. I've been producing data almost every day, but I'm still probably only through 50% of analyzing what it means. And beyond that, interpreting it is going to take me another several months. And so it would be quite extraordinary if we had a faster way to do that. I'm not an expert in machine learning. I'm not an expert in AI, but those people who are experts tell me that that might be a way to really, really speed things up to increase our throughput. I definitely foresee that as being one of the future avenues that this research is going to require. And then earlier, when we were talking on this call, we had discussed the fact that I had to keep these detailed, nitpicky notes about everything that was happening to me for many months in order to even get in the right direction, to find the right specialist in the right part of the body. And one of the things that often I wonder is if people had, we all have, so many people have Apple Watches and they have smart rings, and our phones can track our activity and our movement. And so what if there was a way to collate all of this data and have it analyzed in the cloud by some kind of an AI device, some kind of an AI algorithm? And when there are suspicious or alarming patterns, it alerts your doctor and says, hey, I noticed these things are happening. Do you want to check this out? And your doctor can give you a call and say, hey, we noticed that this might be happening. Can we send you to a specialist for this? That seems like a wave of future upcoming medicine, at least to my naive eyes.
Would concerning Parkinson's, what would those things be? Would this be a tremor? Would it be a change in your gait? What would those things be? What would that look like?
When I was in undergrad, actually, so we had a little group. So I studied neuroscience, but we had a group of engineering students who wanted to develop something for Parkinson's disease. They didn't really have an idea what, and we came up with this. What we thought at the time was a moonshot idea. We said, well, our phones have these accelerometers that can track how fast they're moving and the rhythm at which you're moving. So what if you put a phone in both pockets of a person as they walked, and you got these phones to talk to each other, and you tracked the rhythm by which they walk? Because there's a fair amount of evidence that as a person develops Parkinson's, the rhythm of their walking changes. And lo and behold, fast forward 10 years from that little moonshot project that we had, one of my colleagues, one of my undergrad friends who was working with me on that project, shows up at the Fixel Institute with these little accelerometers that he tapes to people's thighs. And he says, oh, well, I'm studying their gait rhythm. And I said, wow, you actually did it.
That's awesome. Did he go on to develop that? Is that now commercially available?
Not yet. It's still in progress, but I see him very often at the Institute asking the patients to strap these things through their legs as they walk.
That's amazing. That's really awesome. What do you wish? And I ask this quite frequently because I think there's a lot of listeners that may not have a researcher in their family, or they don't speak with them, somebody very frequently. What do you wish the general public knew about what a researcher does or what you do that you just think it's important for them to know?
It really goes back to one of the things we discussed earlier, and it's that research is really, really, really slow. So I wish we could come up with new discoveries every other month. But unfortunately, or fortunately, we end up working years of our lives to come up with one discovery. And maybe that one discovery becomes the next big thing and it becomes a new wave in medicine. But maybe it's just a footnote in somebody else's paper in the future. So, a lot of times I have family members who ask, oh, when are you going to cure Parkinson's disease? I said, no, slow down. We're still at the point where we're trying to understand what's going on. So, I wish we could really jump ahead like that, but I think it's important for those members of the public who really want to know what we do as researchers, we work very slowly and very meticulously. And sometimes it just takes a very long time.
Yeah, and I think I think there is a need for more funding, especially in the early research pointed towards these kind of diseases. But at some point, there is a point where more money is not going to help. It just takes time. It takes time to understand. It takes time to go through the data. It just takes time to do this self-correcting that you've talked about. And of course, we're not at that point right now. But you do hear comments sometimes that, well, we should just take all that money from somewhere else and put it into. Some of it would help for sure. Absolutely, it would help. But at some point, there seems to be you just need that time too.
With our current technology, yes. But going back to, you brought up AI earlier, maybe this is going to speed us up. Maybe this is going to help us sift through the promising areas of research versus the less promising areas. And maybe we'll be more focused and more efficient as a result.
And hopefully, maybe there's other people out there listening to this that are in the technology world, that are in the AI world, the big data world, that would like to talk to you about that, because it's definitely a need. Adithya, you have talked about kind of the aspiration, what you would hope to see, maybe that 5 to 7 years. Are there other things that you just, as you look into the future, that you hope that we achieve, or that you're hopeful that we're going to achieve?
So a lot of times, as scientists, as researchers in an aging related disease, so to speak, we often talk about wanting to treat aging as a disease itself. And I can't, it's hard for me to think of a more miraculous way to approach the way we live our lives than to be able to treat aging. What if we could, stop aging? So many people nowadays live many decades longer than our ancestors did. Back in the early 1900s, people were lucky if they got to 40 or 50, and we're routinely living into our 80s, 90s, and sometimes over 100 now. And so the things that come up as a result of age are coming up more and more frequently, Parkinson's included. And that's one of the things I really hope and dream that one day we'll be able to find a way for us to age in a way that we stay healthy for longer. Because really, what is age without quality of life, right? So being over 100 is wonderful, but it's much better to be able to be over 100 and still traveling the world.
Yeah, and be active and self-sufficient and still curious, and be able to use this wonderful gift of a brain. So
absolutely.
Well, Adithya, as we kind of wrap up here, are there any things that we kind of missed that you wish we would have touched on? Any other kind of thoughts that you would like to share?
To be honest, I think we did a pretty thorough job here.
Good. Well, I know before we started recording, you're very excited with some of the things that you're doing in the lab. You're saying in the next 7 or 8 months there might be some new publications or some things to talk about. So we will definitely have you on again to talk about those things. In the meantime, how do people get a hold of you? How would they? We talked about collaboration being important, just different kind of people talking and kind of brainstorming what's needed. How do people get a hold of you?
So I'm very active on LinkedIn, our professional social network. People can very easily find me there, send me a message. It's just under my name, Adithya Gopinath. And separately, also the university email system. This is the best way to get a hold of me in a professional way, because I check that first thing when I wake up in the morning. So I will definitely see your message.
That's great. Well, I'm wishing you the best of luck here in the next couple months. And, I'm very excited to hear more about what you're doing. And I think all of us just should really appreciate your dedication, your curiosity, your drive, your passion to really understand, our bodies, our brains, the connections, and create new knowledge for how to counter these diseases. And so thank you.
Thank you, Deb. It's always a pleasure, and I really, really appreciate your having me.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.